Good morning, LinkedIn Live. Good morning. It's saying that we're live, but do you know what? It's taking a little while to connect through to LinkedIn these days. But good morning, everyone. If you are listening, good morning. Good morning, Sathya. How are you doing?
I'm good. We were just chatting that it has been a whirlwind International Women's Day.
Yes.
And it slightly takes it out of you a little bit with the body. But
Yeah,
I was saying intersectionality is my bag, and I love chatting
absolutely.
to you. So excited.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much, Sathya, for joining us. And, you know, as you're saying, it has been a busy blip. And I know that you've been like struggling with your voice. So hopefully it's going to hold out for the next half hour. Good morning to everyone that is tuning in live. If you're tuning in live this morning, please do say good morning in the chat. Maybe let us know how your week has been. And my question for this week, maybe let us know, how was your International Women's Day and how are you feeling about International Women's Day? Because I know there are some really mixed thoughts about it. Some people are kind of like hating on it. They're like, we're fed up of the cupcakes, right? Other people are like, you know, we still need to celebrate it. Other people are sort of like reticent. So please do drop a good morning in the chat if you are listening live, and let me know how you are feeling about International Women's Day, because I think actually this might be a topic that we will get into in this conversation about intersectionality. These conversations, so this is, I'm going to say this is the third or fourth that I've done about redefining. Redefining. Good morning. We've had our first good morning in the chat. And I can't see who the name is, but I'm going to guess, because sometimes these names, I'm going to guess it's maybe either Savannah Hanson or it's maybe Jill Wall. Apologies if I've got it wrong. Good morning also to Julie J. Charles, CBE, and thank you for the flowers. Good morning, Julie. And how was International Women's Day for you? If you have some time, just put it in. What were your thoughts about it? Are you fed up of International Women's Day, or you know, how are you feeling? I'm really interested to understand. I've got with me this morning the amazing Sathya Bala, who if you don't know, please do please do go ahead and follow Sathya. She is the founder of some amazing organizations, including My Skin, My Story, which I absolutely love that as the name, I must say, Sathya. My Skin, My Story. And you reached out to us after last year's ERG Leader Summit, I think, didn't you? You know,
Yeah.
to kind of see if we could have a conversation. You've got an incredibly interesting background, both in this work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, sitting on sort of like various advisory panels and boards, etc. But also your background in the corporate life. For those that are interested, you were in the world of luxury fashion, right? So if we have time, maybe we'll get into you know, your time at some, I mean, some, you know, some interesting brands. So you were at Chanel for some time, but you were also in the world of financial services and data. And data also in Chanel, and we're definitely going to get into that. Let me just check into some more Fridays. It's Friday. Good morning, Junior. How are you doing? Junior, bringing the energy already. I always love that about you, Junior. And good morning, Hansa Pednagari. Good morning, Hansa. Good morning, Sabrina Shady, one of the absolute warriors and rock stars in this industry. Good morning. International Women's Day was interesting. I got some beautiful tags and messages, but I feel it's become very performative. And we can maybe come back to that, Sathya, in this conversation. Junior's got here, International Women's Day, incredible for me and our networks this year. I'm doing some male ally work and loving it. And I must say, so obviously Junior works at NatWest and works with the employee networks. And I know that the gender network at NatWest is absolutely killing it, right? And he's all over, you know, collaborations and, you know, looking at things more intersectionally. So that's really interesting. Sathya, welcome. Tell us about how you got into this work, the work of diversity and inclusion, and why you wanted to focus in this area of intersectionality.
Yeah, sure. And you know, the two areas of focus for me are really around data and storytelling. And so
Yeah,
I would be remiss not to share a little bit of my story. So thank you for that
sure.
first question. Because for me, this work is a meeting of the personal and the professional life purpose work, but also kind of the professional skills that I've honed and also lived experience. So in a very brief nutshell, I'm Sri Lankan Tamil. I was born in Singapore, grew up in Sydney, Australia, moved to London when I was 22, 23, have lived here in the UK for the last 16, 17 years. And I, other than a heated debate with my parents when I was 16, when I wanted to be Alicia Keys, that got shut down by my immigrant parents.
Okay.
So I was good at school, so I knuckled down on the corporate world. And so I started. I've been in big corporate my whole career. I started off in audit and risk in a client-facing role at Deloitte in Sydney. Moved to London, as you said, got then into banking. Was at Barclays. Went on to Sainsbury's, a big grocery retail organization for those not in the UK. And that's where I actually fell into data and data governance. It was a lateral move. It was kind of an accident. I had a couple of cheerleaders at Sainsbury's who were like, "We think you should take on this new role." And I was like, okay. And I very quickly realized that I really enjoyed data. It was a super new and emerging field, but one that was adjacent to like data stuff. And obviously tech had been around for a long time, but data governance is about being almost the business translator for data. So it was when, if you can remember, maybe 8-10 years ago, when other than technical folks, people didn't think they used data. People didn't even think about data. They didn't think they created it. They didn't think that it was helpful in decision making. And my job, and anyone in data governance, was to try and get the business to own data, understand its value and quality, and use it to inform decision making. So I was that bridge between the technical folks that got it and the business people that were a bit allergic to data at that time. But in all contexts, right? So we were talking about data in terms of knowing your customer, in terms of finance, in terms of procurement. Then sustainability came along and everyone was like, oh my goodness, environment, social governance, reporting, we need data. And then as my career journey progressed, I popped back into banking in data governance, Barclays, HSBC, Deutsche Bank, got a lay of the land in that scene. And then I took on the role of the global head of data governance at Chanel. This coincided with me kind of reaching that leadership point where you could start to kind of make gentle demands. And I also reached a point where I was sick of being the exception to the rule. Speaking of intersectionality, my experience as a woman of color, succeeding against the odds and in quite senior roles, and particularly once I hit data, which is part of tech that isn't so diverse, I was like, I actually want to be a leadership champion for inclusion. And I said that in my interview to my hiring manager, who was the CFO at Chanel. And that's how this journey began. I was like, how do I use my platform to change things? But also, how do I use my professional skills? So I started to say, inclusion is going to be one more data project on my portfolio where I advise. And so I became besties with the head of diversity and inclusion at Chanel, and I was her data advisor. And I think my number one revelation was, why do data people not know the inclusion people in their own organization, and vice versa? Yeah. And that was kind of the beginning. And I was also doing a lot of groundwork around mobilizing steering groups and working groups and piloting the inclusion survey, because I was like, we need a data baseline. I always came at it from a data standpoint, and that's kind of one of my ways in.
And I mean, so many things, right? So many things in there. I mean, the whole thing about data, and I think it's really interesting, and I'd probably be interested to get anybody that's on this call, if you're in the D&I space, whether that's an employee network or ERG, but the data as a requirement in D&I, I feel it's only recently that people have been making more noise about the fact that this profession needs more data, like it needs to be more evidence-based.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when you were talking, sometimes, you know, people approach me and they say, you know, how can I get into DEI? And one of the things I always say is, what's really useful actually in D&I is when you have a niche. And I think, you know, your strengths in the data, it's like we need that, right? We need more of it, because the understanding of data is absolutely critical when we want to move the dial. Not that everything necessarily can be measured, but usually there is a way of getting an indication as to whether things are actually moving the dial. But the other things that I love that you said as well, the journey of data, I totally remember that. I totally remember it because I was in, you know, running big transformation programs and things like that. So you go in, where the data's a mess. You know, where's the data? The data's a mess. Particularly when it comes to HR data, was a nightmare because unlike the financials, HR data does not need to balance or reconcile. So therefore, it was notoriously all over the shop, basically. So yeah, and the other thing that you said that I love that I wrote down when you got into those senior roles, and I almost like, I wish this for everyone that's watching, you know, to be able to say to somebody, whatever your job is, I want inclusion, you know, and or advocacy to be a part of my day job, right? I
Yeah.
want that to be a part of how I am, you know, kind of like showing up, how I'm measured, how I'm adding value. I think it's just really, really amazing. Yeah, fantastic, Sathya. Just a few comments. Liz Muir, good morning. Liz, how are you doing? Hope you are well. Gitu has said, what an incredible story, Sathya. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for joining us as well, Gitu. Um, uh, really driving it, but then my background is data and evidence-based practice. Jill, I thought that was you, Jill. Thank you so much. So let's get into intersectionality. So one of the reasons that I'm doing these redefining conversations is because DEI, and I've just said it there, has just become an acronym where almost like people have forgotten what these things meant, and we've stopped talking about it in plain language, plain English. So let's just, for those that maybe have come across the term for the first time, or have come across it but, you know, maybe we don't delve into it, what did it mean originally and what do you think it means now? So let's just go into the definition of intersectionality. And just as you're prepping, I'll just read out Sabrina's comment here. I've been doing this for over 25 years. I started in public sector and we were heavily data driven, but I feel data is a massive challenge as so many organizations don't understand how EDI and GDPR can work together, particularly European organizations. Sabrina, I
Yes.
cannot agree with you more. I think GDPR is sometimes used as an excuse almost to not get good data. Elizabeth, Liz has said, usually there is existing data that you can build your interventions on if you look in the right places like engagement surveys, etc. Spot on. Even disaggregating that data by protected characteristics is a start to see where the pockets of dissatisfaction are. Absolutely. We're going to get into all of this. Let's define the intersectionality. Liz and Sabrina are they're already off. They're already ahead of us. So let's get to defining intersectionality.
We'll loop back to that because,
yeah,
I definitely want to comment on that. So intersectionality, let's start with the definition and the origin.
Yeah.
So it was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, an African-American professor. And it's defining the complex cumulative way in which multiple forms of discrimination can have an effect. So this is when we're talking about layering, for example, racism, classism, homophobia, sexism, ableism, how those things aren't just kind of a 1 + 1 = 2, but how those various forms actually combine, overlap, and intersect on the experiences of individuals and groups. And I like to think of it as actually having a multiplier effect, right? So think of a multiplication form. It's not saying actually these things add to the sum of their parts. And it's really important to acknowledge that definition. And, you know, I think intersectionality is really important to understand. We're talking about specific groups that face that multiple layers of bias, barriers. But I also think intersectionality is a bit slept on. Maybe it's because it's a bit of a mouthful, because I think it's the ultimate bridge builder when we're talking about building a effective work cultures and inclusion. Because the spirit of intersectionality, I think, can be distilled by this awesome Audre Lorde quote, which we can all relate to, which is, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, right? And so this is where it is really important that we do not erase the fact that certain groups really experience pronounced intersectional struggles. But do you know what? It's not just the things on face value. If we expand out that definition, intersectionality can be something where you're experiencing it on, yes, race, ethnicity, gender identity, class. It can be language, it can be religion, it can be mental health, it can be age, it can be education. I've seen body size as an example, and there's so many. You could be a white man that grew up in foster care, who had, financial insecurity, and you have lived an intersectional life. And so I think it's really powerful when we acknowledge layers to this. And obviously there are groups that experience this in a codified way where there's institutional discrimination. But we all know what it is to not fit into a box, to edit ourselves, to rock up to a new school when we were kids and be like, what are the things that will be valued and what's cool versus not? What do I need to hide? We know what it's like to rock up to a new workplace and do that same kind of calculation, which is why I think intersectionality is something that can be the ultimate piece that makes inclusion and culture work not about helping these people over there, but helping all of us, because we all have skin in the game.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and I love that quote, that Audre Lorde quote. I haven't heard that one before. I love that. I've written that down. But the point that you're almost like concluding on there is that when we look hard enough, for everyone, the chances are that actually intersectionality is something that in and of itself almost can be quite inclusive, because if you look hard enough, often individuals do have these, elements of, as they say, tailwinds, some of which are codified and some of which are based on, I guess, more obvious protected characteristics, some of which are visible. And there is probably a different dynamic about some of those. But you're right, it could actually be quite a unifying lens of kind of like looking at this work and then looking at what are the interventions that we need. So that was a really, really cool analysis there of the definition of intersectionality. Would you believe, just after we're not going to talk about politics, but a few weeks ago there was a webinar in the States pulled together by all sorts of organizations. Kimberly Crenshaw was on that webinar. Would you believe? I was like,
fangirl. I want to be her friend. That's all.
I was literally like starstruck. And you're right in terms of, when that work came out, the original work around intersectionality, it was off the back of, obviously, women's rights were really progressing, and there was a lot of legislation coming in about equality for women, etc. But Kimberly kind of like called out, and this is something I'm sure we'll get into, that it wasn't quite. So there were rights about women, and there were rights about race and ethnicity, but Kimberly sort of called out, hang on a minute, we're not really looking at the intersection of the two, right? Which I think is absolutely fascinating. But as you said, it's we now look at it even more broadly than that, right? Broadly than just race and gender, as you said so eloquently. If anybody, it has missed that definition, I'm definitely going to be clipping that down just to capture your definition of what intersectionality is. Let's go on to why it's important in terms of within the realm of this work. Why is it important to look intersectionally when we're doing this work?
Yeah, sure. So, coming back to how I've ended up in this work, I had a great time at Chanel, but at the same time as heading up data, at the same time as leading inclusion initiatives, I was also, while I was at Chanel, I launched My Skin, My Story, a community for women of color, because I realized data is only as good as us acknowledging the fact that every data point is a human story. And we can only really understand the impact of the issues, but also the impact when we unlock inclusion, when we understand data to get the scale of issues, but the human stories to understand the real life implications, right? It's that depth and that breadth. And we've talked about the fact that intersectionality is many things, but I personally had experienced, and through my own personal and professional community that over indexes with women of color, because they're a community that has supported me, I was like, I want a space where we're uplifting and spotlighting women of color specifically. And to your point, it's because it isn't actually just a feeling I had. The data in me, I'm going to throw you some data at you.
Amazing.
There's a great organization called the Fawcett Society in the UK. So I'm bringing up the UK as an example, but there is growing research in other parts of the world. Now, a couple of years ago, they did a pay and progression of women of color piece of research. And there's a whole lot of data, but I'm going to share a few things with you around the fact that when we only tailor, if we only look at an issue and only come up with measures to help people that look at only one element of diversity, we miss a lot of issues. So, for example, 1/3, 30% of women of color report being unfairly passed over for or denied promotion at work. If we look at, again, this was a couple of years ago, we know that at school, Black girls are twice as likely to be excluded permanently compared to white girls and are placed in lower sets than warranted by their ability. We know that at a senior leadership stage, women of color report that the leadership and communication styles of white women are more positively perceived than their own, and they have to change to fit that organizational culture to gain seniority. There's a whole lot of data here that shows there is a differential when we start to break this down. On the flip side, I will share kind of when we have these spaces that allow you to bring your full intersectional selves. You know, I still run My Skin, My Story. That is one of the elements of my business. My business, True Change, was born of this. Let's not keep data and storytelling separate. Let's bring data and storytelling together to drive inclusive culture change. I can tell you the power of when intersectionality is a struggle, but it is also a superpower. If you're someone who has navigated gender, race, and culture, I'll tell you right now, they're the people in your organizations that are super resilient, adaptive. They are early adopters because they are culturally intelligent and nuanced. They are baked into cross-cultural working from when they were kids. I know I was when I thought, okay, I'm doing my Indian classical dancing on the weekend, and then I'm going and playing netball at school in my private school and navigating those things. So I've thrown a few things at you, but this is where I think it's really important also that we look at data intersectionally, and it's about weighing up the real issues and getting to the root cause, but also then designing things that will really level the playing field and not leave anyone behind. It's about who are we leaving in the cracks. Let's expose those cracks. Data is a great way to expose things that we don't know, unknowns.
Absolutely. Oh, Sathya, so many gems, right? So where do we even start? So I know like for some organizations, they've been reporting, for example, gender pay gap data for a while. And as you referenced there, the Fawcett Society, I would encourage everyone, if you have not looked into the gender pay gap by ethnicity, and now I would add in potentially age as well, you need to do that. Like you have to be looking with that lens. And I know things are changing with the new like workers' rights bill and all of that, but we've got to look at these things intersectionally. I'm just going to bring in a couple of comments here. So we've got a comment here from Julie J. Charles. I have always advocated for intersectionality in the space of disability and race. It's a very difficult journey for many. When you're a disabled person of race, I have advocated for intersectionality as it is the only way we see people as whole. The holistic way of life for many is often not the way in which the system sees it. Systems are not set up to embrace intersectionality. You're right there. Systems really aren't. They're just not. They're not nuanced enough. They're not complex. They don't have enough sort of lenses and angles. Somebody here, I think this is Darpan. Good morning, Darpan. I was an EDI lead during Greg Dyke's tenure at the BBC. There was zero data to help inform and underpin any change or improvement. I've since moved into government and have seen a different landscape where harvesting data within EDI and particularly resourcing is paramount. Loving the content. What an amazing insight, Sathya. As a British Asian woman, I found so much segregation within intersectionality and the struggle for a number of professionals to join the dots. It's not easy, is it, in terms of cracking the data around it? It's not easy.
But I will jump in and say, even though systems aren't built for it, and again, we try to compartmentalize things as humans, even in our organizational design, one issue at a time. You know what is the unlocker where actually data, you don't have to collect anything extra to look at data intersectionally. That's your lowest point of entry. The amazing thing with intersectionality is all you're doing is now filtering with two things rather than one thing in terms of data. So I do think one way to push against this kind of design and thinking of one issue at a time, which I fully acknowledge is true, data is our underutilized source, because you don't have to do anything extra. It's using the data you have and looking at it with kind of 2 or 3 filters on it rather than one.
Absolutely. Yeah, just get those Excel filters on it. Junior's comment here, intersectionality awareness was one of the first things I brought into my ERG, employee resource group, employee-led network in networks as well, which opened up fascinating topics like LGBT and faith, wow, or focusing on queer people of colour during Black History Month and Pride. Engagement on those topics was great. Junior, I absolutely love that. And no, because those intersections, LGBT and faith, wow, we could do a whole, maybe I need to get you on here, Junior, to do a whole LinkedIn live on that. A question for Sathya: how would you respond to colleagues who feel EDI is another form of positive discrimination instead of improving equality and understanding of intersectionality in our professional environment? Really great question there.
Yeah, so I think actually intersectionality gives us the nuance that we sometimes lose in these conversations that get a little bit heated and weaponized. So when I talk about intersectionality, you know, you can have a wheel of all the different characteristics. What I often talk about is that me as an individual, I experience intersectional struggles from for example, race and gender standpoint, but I also experience intersectional privilege on a sexuality standpoint, an accent standpoint, which is something we don't talk about enough, the intersection with accent. And actually the point is I hold both. And when you look at intersectionality and not look at things one issue at a time, you see that complexity. There's something powerful about me as a brown woman talking quite candidly and openly without shame about my privileges at the same time. And so I think with intersectionality, it's actually the biggest conversation opener to say, this is not about helping this one group over here where maybe these other people don't belong to that group. So I think that's one core element. And again, let's bring it back to, it's important we define intersectionality and really help people who are the most marginalized. But let's also tap into the spirit of intersectionality, which is not fitting into boxes. We do not live single issue lives, as the great Audre Lorde says. And that's something everyone can relate to. It's very hard to say this is this is a woke agenda if it's helping everyone. Intersectionality proves that it does.
I think you're absolutely spot on. I actually think it's part of almost like the rebuttal of positive discrimination, because it actually proves that you still have these discrepancies. And even, you know, one of the examples that you gave was men, you know, so it might be, you know, somebody's a white man, but they're from a lower socioeconomic class, or they're a white man with a disability or whatever it be. And actually, it's when you do the intersectionality, you realize there is this complexity. It's not straightforward. Even with I'm going to come on to Sophie Hume's point shortly, but even with the pay gap, I was saying to you off air, you know, and it's been reported this year, younger women, and again, this does need to be done more intersectionally, but younger women are now being reported as earning more than younger men. This is just at the highest level. Obviously, we would need to do the intersection analysis. But that probably, as a headline, is probably being used to justify, oh, there is
Yeah.
positive discrimination, da 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 da. But we need to delve into it to actually understand what is happening. Which which other identities are sort of doing better than others, and I bet we would see something different. I'm going to pull in Sophie's point here now. Good morning, Sophie. At Progress Together, we now have data on over 200,000 employees across financial services. We analyse our member data for them. The intersectionality focus is key. In 2023, we found that women from working class backgrounds progress 21% slower than their female peers from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, but men from working class backgrounds only progress 13% slower than their male peers from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. Isn't that really interesting? And
And
thank you for dropping that
progression.
link, Sophie. Yeah, the
Yeah, because
progression.
that's what I was going to say. Because I've worked in retail, as we've talked about, and actually,
Yeah,
there's a lot of organisations where they don't have a issue around inclusion and diversity at lower levels, but then
yeah,
it flips. So what does it say? It's even
yeah,
more compelling, actually, I would say, if we
yeah,
have more women that are higher paid at junior levels, and then that completely flips the other way as we
yeah.
move the ladder.
Yeah, and the other point, and Sophie, if you're still on, if you can comment on this, but I think the other point that makes. So at the start of this conversation, Satya, you explained how sometimes when these intersectionalities are layered on, there's a multiplier effect,
Yeah,
right? Which we know in terms of gender and race, we know that obviously if you are a female and if you're say non-white, etc., the multiplier is things are going to get worse, right? But I'm wondering, Sophie, I'd be really interested in your take on this when you then layer on male, does male privilege kind of kick in to actually compensate potentially for some of the, sort of like adverse identity factors? That's what the data suggests, Sophie, but please do correct me if I'm jumping to conclusions there. But that's what it seems to suggest, Satya. Would you agree with that? That there are
yeah, I
certain
think
group characteristics that can, do you know what I mean? That kind of have an impact.
exactly. So, and also at any given point when we're looking at data, there is going to be certain characteristics that are more have more of an impact
Yeah,
on these
yeah, yeah,
stats than others,
yeah,
and it also depends on what part of the world you're in. I think there's not enough discussion in the UK around the intersection between race and class, because actually that is the biggest overlapping area.
oh yeah,
We need to look at
yeah,
socioeconomic background holistically, but we also need to make sure that we don't underestimate the things. Are we really looking at the things that are most linked? And this is where data
yeah,
is amazing. Get your in-house data experts, data scientists. They'll tell you what are the factors that are the most correlated. That's where
mm,
your most interesting interventions can come in to have a real
yeah,
impact on people. And just kind of looping back to some early comments around
yeah,
actually where there might be pushback around, can we do things with data because of data privacy, because of GDPR, which is the data
yeah,
privacy regulation in the European Union, which a lot of
yeah,
the UK also has to adopt if you have a big presence in Europe. Um, this was one of my big draw cards here. We have so much to do still to build data confidence and data literacy with
yeah,
everyone in our business, but especially people who are change makers around inclusion. I
yeah,
started a forum, which I still run, called Data Meets DEI, which was about talking about this. Um, there is always a workaround in terms of what we can and can't do with data. And often the answer is not that we can't do this with data. The answer is, how do we mitigate the risk that there might be around privacy? And there's usually well-established things that we can do to make sure that privacy isn't compromised. But I think what
right,
happens is it's sometimes used, and if we can't challenge back that
yeah,
privacy debate, we get discouraged from looking at the data. But let's
yeah,
actually address the root cause here. The data is the only way to get to the heart of the root cause of issues. And people
yeah,
are a bit afraid of data because actually it tells us
yeah,
things sometimes we're not ready for. So, how do we build leadership and people's confidence and trust in data along the way. And also make people feel okay that it's okay that initially the data might point to issues. We want to know the issues so we can act on it. It's not about reporting a bad report card. It's about saying this work is about transparency. And to make any real change with inclusion, transparency and accountability are two number one levers. And transparency only happens with data. And accountability only really happens when we look at taking ownership holistically of issues, which includes intersectionality.
Absolutely. Oh, I love it. Absolutely love it. And the one final thing that I would add around this topic as well, especially around the GDPR and the positive discrimination point that somebody made, just sort of clarifying. Obviously, we are sort of like based in the UK, and we're talking predominantly about the UK. And I just want to remind people of the law around positive action versus positive discrimination. So in the UK, positive action is legal, but actually, if you can make your data more intersectional, I feel that you've got an even stronger defense around your interventions, right? It can actually really help with the rebuttal to these accusations around positive discrimination, which in the UK, positive discrimination is unlawful, okay, but positive action is legal. The data can definitely help. There is a question here that I'm probably going to wrap things up with, because I'm going to talk about the one thing maybe that we want to leave people with shortly. But a lovely question here from Gitu. In light of the villainisation of DEIB work at present, diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging work at present, what have been your personal observations of the challenges and also opportunities? We're going to come back to that, Gitu. And then Sophie, yes, there's a great book called Class Ceiling by Sam Friedman that talks all about this. Definitely recommend it. Our evidence shows that social class has the biggest impact on career progression, but when you lay on ethnicity and gender and disability, it gets worse. Gotta jump. Okay, thank you so much, Sophie, for your insights, and that sounds like a really good organization to look at in terms of if you want to go to like big data sets, and maybe if you're at a really small company and you don't have the data sets, or you're below the 250 threshold and you're just trying to get an insight into what's out there generally. And obviously there's also census data, right, in the ONS, if you wanted to look at your regions. A plea there from Liz to connect with anyone that's working in or across Europe on data or DEI. You clearly, Liz, you need to be connecting with Sathya after this.
Yes,
this session.
Yeah, reach out. The Data Meets DEI forum is the place to be, because we need to steal each other's good ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to this question here that Gitu raised. What are our personal observations of the challenges and also the opportunities? And I feel that this conversation really is leaning into that. What are some of the opportunities around, this work at the moment, even in spite of the villainisation of this work?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to zoom out and look at the fact that it depends on what part of the world that you're in. So, for example, yesterday I spoke at an International Women's Day event for a large global organization, but it was for their APAC region, so Asia Pacific, including Australia and New Zealand. The focus is strong there. I was talking to someone who does a lot of work in South Africa. We've also got to connect the dots of where are the economies growing. I mean, if we talk about gender equity, I did a piece of work in the UAE.
That's exactly where I was thinking as well.
They are not basically, that's an economy that's growing, that has money, and they will not do business with organizations that are not getting right behind gender equity in their public sector. They have made such progress. It's the private sector that is woefully behind, and everyone's kind of rallying to do that. So I think this is where the ultimate opportunity is around, first, let's put these things into perspective. Of course, the political narrative has an impact in the US and has a knock-on impact. Everyone is paying attention. But there is, I think, looping back to the start, and then Cheryl, I'll pass back to you, is intersectionality is the thing we're sleeping on, because it's the ultimate bridge builder. And if we take away all the noise, this kind of villainization of diversity and inclusion is about division, right? Which is actually, it's bigger than our world. This is the politics of division that's happening in health, in so many things. And so intersectionality is the bridge builder. So the opportunity here is, let's focus on the things that build the bridges, because that's the number one counteraction to what's happening now, which is dividing, right? So those are my thoughts.
Amazing. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I totally agree with you in terms of, Gitu, I do think it's important to remember that some of this is political, right? So some of this it's bigger than DEI. It's not just about DEI. Some of it is about power, right? And like legacy power and shifting models, right? But the opportunities, I think this whole conversation around data, if you can get the data that kind of really illuminates what the challenges are around DEI and why it's being done and what the benefits will be and what the impact will be. I really think that's the thing. It's having a really compelling case of what it is that needs doing. I won't go into it too much because I'm sort of conscious of time, but those would be my things. I think this conversation here hopefully has given lots of information and lots of suggestions as to what can be done to kind of strengthen the DEI work. So we're going to wrap things up now because we've gone way over, and some people are like, I've got a meeting to go to. So we're just going to wrap up with, if there's one bit of advice, one thing that individuals and or organizations could do today, or straight away, what would your advice be, Sathya? What do you want to leave people with?
With one question that you can ask to anyone, which is, are we looking at this intersectionally? ? That can be applied to anything. So International Women's Day, that's something. If we're going into Pride, if we are looking at our accessibility guidelines. So when I was at Chanel, we started to look at the disability lens on actually how we design boutiques. Can we actually have a baseline framework in terms of when you build and approve new boutiques? And how do we look at anything intersectionally? And the very quick answer to that is, can we look at the data intersectionally? And that is your power. It's like, are we asking the right questions? To me, I think let's make sure these current narratives aren't achieving what they're trying to, which is silencing. The other response to silence is asking questions. Asking questions is not scary because you're not pretending to have an answer, but it encourages discussion and digging deeper into the issue. And I would just say, to your point around finding the positive here, another piece of data I would encourage everyone to look at, WPP, a huge media organization, they did a great research report called the Consumer Equality Index report. WPP published it with one of their agencies, I think Ogilvy, and it has compelling evidence that the population growth in the UK over the next, it was either 40 or 60 years, shows exponential growth in the spending potential of ethnic minority population, and actually the complete loss that brands will experience if they don't tap into that market. How can we, as organizations, deliver to customers that we don't know and don't understand and we don't have in our own organizations, when actually the data shows those are the populations that are growing with spend potential? This is like business 101. You don't even have to get lost in the political conversation. This is just, we would never ignore something like this if it was about anything else. This is about business. This is about customer. This is about serving our society and following the trends that the data shows are there. So 100% recommend that. Sometimes about finding an answer that cuts through all the noise, and use data for that.
That was the mic drop moment right there, right? Because I'm all about, when I put my accountant's hat on, I'm all about what is the business. If you can demonstrate a business case like that in terms of, to your questions, your first point was, the one thing that people could do is ask this question: are we looking at this intersectionally? And then if somebody says to especially if you're in a consumer facing organization, but other organizations as well, you can then just drop this will be so first of all, you ask the question and then you have that mic drop of, this report says this. So if we're not doing this, we're missing a trick. We're not going to understand our consumers, our clients, our service users. Boom. Yeah. Done. Done. Bish bash bosh. Okay. Yeah. What is that report, please? We will drop it in the chat. It was the WPP, the Consumer Equality Index, and I think you said it was with Ogilvy. Good morning, Deirdre Labassiere. So that report, that sounds
use
like
that report.
that's gold.
And
it's gold.
And that'll be the case in a lot of parts of the world, because those are the communities where population growth is still a thing. And businesses won't grow unless customers buy into their business. So this is the number one bottom line.
Absolutely. Amazing. Sathya, thank you so much. Honestly, the gems, right, from this morning's conversation. And that's why this is why I wanted to do these redefining series. It's because we don't talk about these concepts enough. You know, the words get thrown about, but we don't talk about them enough. So thank you so much. I think I've done so far. I've done inclusion. I've done redefining DEI, but I am breaking it down. So I think the next one I'm doing is redefining authenticity. I think is the next one. I am going to be doing one about redefining equity and equality as well. So those are coming up. But hopefully everybody's finding these useful. Sathya, I can't thank you enough. Honestly, it was amazing.
Thank you.
And where can people find you? So if people want to find out more about what you do and connect with you, where's the best place to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so please do check out my LinkedIn, Sathya Bala, and my business, True Change. And because it is in the vein of International Women's Day, do great work around also women's empowerment. So we have an Invest in Her program with intersectionality baked into the design. So you can find all of that on my LinkedIn page.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sathya. And to everybody that has been a part of this conversation, watching this live, thank you so much for spending some of your Friday morning with us. And if you're watching this on the replay, thank you for taking time out of your day to watch this. Have an amazing weekend, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.